Major force, or force majeure, is generally referenced as a clause in contract law that relates to superior force or a cataclysmic event such as civil unrest or so-called acts of God that render the execution of a contract impossible, practically impossible. And often in contracts they'll write up a force majeure clause or a major force clause. However, this concept can relate to many other things. The components that can embody these forces would be called force composition, or whatever composes these forces. And the first one that we'll look at are, of course, the armed forces, which usually will be represented as an army or a navy in the past, or could be the Air Force or other such armed forces. A second component of the armed forces are the police, often referred to as paramilitary, because there are other units not called police but that serve the same purpose. Now, moving a little bit into the other area of armed forces, we find security forces or marshals that can be considered part of the armed forces because they carry arms. And of course, the last component of armed forces and the most ridiculed and hardest to co-opt, control, or corrupt are, of course, the armed citizenry or civilians that carry arms, meaning they have no specific edict or mandate. Next, in the composition of forces, we find the unarmed forces element, which can mostly be found in a variety of areas, but usually are strikers or protesters. Now, civil forces is the last component of force composition, and civil forces are workers, or people that control some sort of transitive commodity, such as office workers or secretaries. And of course, these could also be found as doctors or nurses. And they are also in considered lower level areas, such as rail workers and delivery workers, because the civil forces compose the movement and makeup of the society. Now, when we look at a different subject, the four horses of the apocalypse, we find a element or a similarity in the belief of spirit horses that the Mongol people and other nomadic cultures, or so-called nomadic cultures, hold. And that spirit horse usually embodies some sort of vehicle that carries an individual through life to achieve some life goal of some sort. And it could be anything, and it could be considered synonymous with career, although career is usually a word that is denoting some sort of slavery position or some sort of mechanism for a system of control, whereas the spirit horse is relative to the individual and can correlate to a spirit animal. Of course, nowadays, a better example might be a spirit car, or, as in the case of some popular fiction, a spirit motorcycle, such as with the popular character Ghost Rider. Notice he's a rider of a ghost or a spirit. When we look at the four horses, we find the first one to be the white horse. And this horse mostly represents information, and it can be found embodied in a canvas or a blank canvas. And the blank canvas, just like the color white, represents existence because it is a blank piece that is open for the creator, just like we are blank slates and our creations are open to whatever we want them to be, whether or not that's ugly or otherwise. And that's the reason why the color white can represent existence and purity. But it could also, of course, be blue, but that's for a different subject. It could also, of course, be found, or the white horse could also be found in the blank pages of a book, the white pages, shall we say. And it could also be embodied in a notepad or white paper, because the color white in paper is the important part here. And it could also be found in the white lab coats of the medical industry and doctors or scientists. And it is no surprise that the symbol caduceus is representative of the medical industry, considering the caduceus was carried by Hermes, the messenger god, which of course refers to information and the spread of it. Next, we have the red horse. Now, the color red is symbolic of blood leaving the body of living creatures, human beings, a horse, shall we say. And it is also symbolic of passion. And the red horse might mean action, but it also means putting one's skin in the game, specifically engaging oneself physically into a situation. Now, this color red is embodied in many ways, but the most obvious is in the red flag of the matador or bullfighter, and it can also be found in the color red of British military uniforms, often called the red coats. And also, the color red can be embodied in the MAGA hats, which are red. And it can also be found in the color of a stop sign, signaling the action of stopping or arresting of movement. It is a bright color. Next is the color black. The black horse mainly symbolizes resource, and it can be easily found in oil, or how oil is represented as black, called black gold. And this is also represented in black rock, the name of a major commodity controlling firm or a holding group, as they're referred to, but they control commodities or resources. And it can also be found in the representation of human resource, such as with the so-called Black Lives Matter movement, which orchestrated a human resource. Then we have the green horse, or the pale horse, which represents the overwhelming power of nature, or at least its use. It embodies, of course, a spirit vehicle of nature. It could be found in tornadoes or some sort of storm, a hurricane maybe, but it could also be found in the rather simple element of trees and plants and growth of nature. And the pale horse can be represented in other ways, such as the green color of banknotes, specifically in the United States, but there are, of course, other colors that have correlated with banknotes. But this is the lifeblood color of a Druidic person or a corporate entity, where instead of bleeding red, if you want to kill a Druidic person or a corporate entity, you have to make them bleed green, meaning you have to take the lifeblood of that entity, which is, of course, property. Banknotes represent that in green. And then the earth is represented in green also because of nature. Now, when we look at various examples of how these horses, these spirit horses, work, on the Wikipedia article of the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse, it explains two parts that give us an idea of how these concepts correlate to the Mongol spirit horse. Zechariah, it says, the book of Zechariah twice mentions colored horses. In the first passage, there are three colors: red, speckled, /brown, and white. And in the second, there are four teams of horses: red, black, white, and finally dappled or grizzled and bay, pulling chariots. The second set of horses are referred to as the four spirits of heaven, going out from standing in the presence of the Lord of the whole world. They are described as patrolling the earth and keeping it peaceful. It may be assumed by some Christian interpretation that when the tribulation begins, the peace is taken away, so their job is to terrify the places in which they patrol. The four living creatures, well, this is the next part, Ezekiel. The four living creatures of Revelation 4, 6 through 8 are written very similarly to the four living creatures in Ezekiel 1, 5 through 12 in Revelation. Each of the living creatures summons a horseman, where in Ezekiel the living creatures follow wherever the Spirit leads without turning. Of course, it would be more accurate to say that the living creatures summon horses, spirit horses, which they then ride instead of follow. And of course, as we know, the Bible's heavily edited. In Ezekiel 14:21, the Lord enumerates his four disastrous acts of judgment, English Standard Version: sword, famine, wild beasts, and pestilence against the idolatrous elders of Israel. A symbolic interpretation of the four horsemen links the rider to the judgment or the similar judgments in 6:11 through 12. Of course, we have to read between the lines here because there's a lot of obfuscation and misdirection here, as usual. Because the Druidic people and the corrupt attempt to embody the four horsemen, but they can't actually invoke the four horses because they aren't living creatures, they're non-living Druidic entities. So they attempt to represent the four horsemen of the apocalypse, and then they also try to present them as something bad or evil, because it's in the way that they present violence and force as something bad or evil that only they can practice it. They are the masters of it, and the rest of us aren't. We're not allowed to use it. It's the same thing with the four spirit horses. We are not allowed to use the four spirit horses, only they are. But that's not true. The four spirit horses, of course, are just that, spirit horses. And also, these elements are corroborated in the four winds of the medicine wheel, which are represented usually with four colors, and of course the four worlds, the upper and lower worlds, depending on which culture. And we can also find this with somewhat different color schemes, at least with the white being blue, in the four color personalities. But these are simply just tactics and elements that can be used by anyone, but today are mostly only used by the corrupt.